So thank you everyone for coming to this webinar. This is the first of 3 sessions on the Pitcairn Islands marine research. We're very excited to talk to you about the work that's been done here under the Blue Belt programme, which was established in 2016 to support the UK overseas territories with the protection and sustainable management of their marine environments. This is primarily conducted by CEFAS and the Marine Management Organisation, but is assisted by a number of partners such as the JNCC. Pitcairn Islands have been part of this programme since the very beginning, with their fully no-take MPA also being designated in 2016. They now also have a marine science base where research can be conducted in one of the most remote locations on the planet. This first session is integrating marine science and community knowledge in the Pitcairn Islands, results from the 2023-2024 expeditions, and is presented by Edinburgh University colleagues. The second session will be on the 13th of March at 11 AM, which will focus on CEFAS-led research expeditions and introduce the ongoing fisheries monitoring being conducted on Pitcairn. And the third and final session will be a workshop held on the 25th of March at 5 PM, which will provide an opportunity to talk with the local Pitcairn team live on island, learn more about the Marine Science Base, and ask questions about travel and logistics. After the final session, we will be sending out a feedback form where we'd love to hear from you what you think of this work and researching at Pitcairn's Marine Science Base. These talks are going to be recorded, but the discussions won't be. Questions can be asked at the end over the microphone by raising your hand to let us know, or they can be typed into the chat at any time. This session is scheduled to end at 3 PM, but it might slightly overrun if there are a few more questions. I'd like to introduce our colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Georgia Holley and Professor Rob Ogden, who will be presenting this first session. Dr. Georgia Holley is an interdisciplinary postdoctoral researcher whose research focuses on the interconnections between natural and cultural marine resources and addressing the management of these resources within integrated policies and frameworks for the sustainable development of the ocean and coastal communities. Professor Rob Ogden is the Director of Conservation Science at the university. He focuses on using genetic data to inform conservation management of wildlife and to support wildlife crime investigations. He especially enjoys working at the interface between academic inquiry and application, bridging the gap between novel scientific developments and the needs of conservation end users. I'll now pass on to Georgia and Rob.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. My name is Rob Ogden. I'll be starting the presentation this afternoon, and then I'll hand over to Georgia about halfway through, and then we'll slightly tag team a little bit at the end. And this presentation is on behalf of quite a few different colleagues and co-authors who've contributed to the work who are listed on this slide. Okay, so a little bit of an overview. I'm going to briefly talk about Pitcairn science expeditions that we use to generate most of the data that we're about to show you. Then we'll talk about the ecosystem survey results. So this is a little bit of chemistry, but mostly biological survey data. Then Georgia will talk about social science that she's been doing on island, looking at the community of Pitcairn Islanders and how they relate to the marine protected area. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the end about how we can perhaps integrate these two forms of data for a better future management approach. So as many of you will probably already be aware, Pitcairn is a very, very remote and very, very unique ecosystem, a series of islands with different geologies in the middle of the South Pacific. It is a marine protected area that covers the entire set of islands in the chain, and it's one of the largest marine protected areas in the world. It's been established for a number of years, and there's been a huge amount of effort looking to characterize it, understand its biology and its local cultural heritage. And the conservation research that we're talking about is really contributing information to how best to manage this going forwards. The data in the 2023-2024 cruises was generated through use of these research vessels. So this is the Silver Supporter on the left. This is the main support vessel that services the UK overseas territories in the South Pacific. And from the MV Silver Supporter, a number of smaller boats can be launched and run for collection of seawater samples and various forms of marine science analysis. So these were basically the main platforms that were used for the two research expeditions in the subsequent years. And this is just an example of the cruise route. So on the 2023 cruise, the Silver Supporter went and travelled from these 4 different points: Oeno Island, which is a coral atoll; Pitcairn itself, which is a volcanic seamount; a smaller subsea seamount to the south east, which is known as Adams Seamount; and then Henderson Island to the far east. And this was repeated to some extent with slightly different localities in the 2024 survey. So to jump straight into some of the science, one of the things that we've been looking at the University of Edinburgh is carbonate chemistry. This is really important in terms of looking at biological production within marine environments, and is currently challenged through increasing levels of ocean acidification. So with decreasing pH in the water, you get reduced carbonate availability for phytoplankton and zooplankton to grow. And this overall has an impact on lowered biological production. The graph in the bottom right, or the picture in the bottom right, shows the global nature of this threat at the moment. So this is showing that on balance, we've got reduced carbonate availability to the biological system throughout the world's oceans. So in Pitcairn, there were samples taken, water samples taken. They were processed on island and then taken back to the University of Edinburgh for carbonate analysis. And these are some of the results. These are just a snapshot of the data that we got, but you can see that we were measuring pH at different depths. We were looking at aragonite levels as well, and essentially the lower the aragonite level, the lower the level of carbonate available for biological production. And you can see that we are unfortunately looking at a system where we've got predicted reductions in aragonite over the next 50 years or so, which is really going to start to impact on biological production. The 2 lines here, we've got the Pitcairn Islands in the South Pacific, and the other line, slightly higher, is a line from the British Indian Ocean territories. So this kind of baseline data is really, really important for understanding the long-term situation with biodiversity conservation in our UK overseas territories and Pitcairn in particular. Turning to biodiversity now, and some of the rationale for studying this in quite a lot of detail in Pitcairn. So as we've seen, it's an incredibly remote group of islands. It doesn't suffer from commercial fishing because of the marine protected area, and it doesn't really have any industrial pollution levels, which means that it's really, really interesting potential baseline case study for looking at what biodiversity should be there in a relatively untouched system, and using that as a way of measuring change over time, both within the Pitcairn Islands, but also for other systems in other places that may have already suffered more anthropogenic damage. So we think Pitcairn could be a very unique system from that perspective. And in terms of actually monitoring the biodiversity that's in the water, there are a range of different approaches that can be used. Traditionally, we've used a lot of fisheries data and fisheries catch statistics to understand what's in an ecosystem. And we can also look at dive surveys. We can look at remote underwater video, and I'll show you some of that in a second. But one of the things we wanted to look at in Pitcairn was the use of environmental DNA. And there are a number of reasons for that. Partly, it gives this whole picture of the trophic web. So as well as looking at larger marine fish, marine species, we can get right down into the smaller invertebrates and all the way down to microbial levels of diversity. And it gives a sort of more potentially comprehensive picture of what's in the marine ecosystem, and allows us to understand the ecological food webs in greater detail. So for the eDNA work in Pitcairn, This was done by sending bottles down to various depths from the small inflatable boats, taking water samples, bringing them back to the surface, and then processing those water samples. So the middle picture here you can see is seawater being pushed through a small filter. We discard the water that's flowed through, but the filter itself is kept. That's frozen and transported back to the lab at the university. And we've taken water samples through this method, so filters from a variety of depths and a variety of positions within Pitcairn over the 2 years. And when we get back to the lab, we basically take those filters, we subject them to DNA extraction processes. So we lyse the cells within the filter paper, we incubate overnight, and then we extract the DNA. And then when we've got our extracted DNA from each of the samples, we undertake a process of PCR. And with the PCR, what we're trying to do is target different taxonomic groups for subsequent DNA sequencing. So we might have groups of fish that we want to target. Other types of PCR will target things like sponges, marine vertebrates, or sometimes particular groups of fish like elasmobranchs. So we've taken an approach where we've targeted multiple different sets of organisms within the same sample using different PCR experiments. And these are some of the results that we've had. So I'll quickly explain this graph on the left because it's quite complicated. So along the bottom, we've got the 6 different sample sites that we took eDNA samples from over the 2 years. And on the y-axis or on the side, we've got 5 different depth categories. So we sampled in all places at 30, 60, and 120 meters. 2 places at 200 meters and 3 places at 2 meters. So we haven't got complete sample coverage due to some of the limitations in the field. And the different colors represent the different species that were detected using DNA. And you've got the different compositions there. So you can see, for example, in the top left corner, Adam's seamount at 2 meters. You've got maybe 5 or possibly 6 different colors, and the lines get very thin, representing the different species that were detected. And on the right hand side, you've got the species legend, so we can see the types of species that we're seeing. So the data here is quite heavily dominated by sort of very large pelagic fish species, so blackjack, so jacks and groupers, black-tip grouper and comet grouper. So these are the light blues and the greens and the light pinks. But we've also got an awful lot more in there. So you can see from the list on the right, I think that was the top 20 species that we detected. And we detected, I think, something around about 50 species in total. And so by looking at the different species compositions at different depths and also at different localities, we can start to characterize ecological differences among the different sampling places. So this is looking at the different depths in a bit more detail, looking at taxonomic richness. So on the y-axis here, we have a sort of combined index of species diversity. And again, you can see here you've got the highest levels of diversity in the shallowest waters, and particularly that third column, which represents the coral reef atoll. So that may not be too surprising in terms of diversity levels on the coral reef. And this type of analysis allows us to look at changes across depths and across sites. And obviously, if we set this as a baseline, you can then start to look at changes across time as well. And lastly, in terms of the eDNA results, this is a principal components analysis plot, which is essentially a multivariate analysis visualized over 2 axes, where we're looking at levels of diversity at the different sites. So you've got the different codings for the different sites in the colors, and then the different depths for the different symbols. And you can see we've got quite a lot of consistency in certain parts here. So Adam's seamount is clustering as a group. I think, Bounty Bay off the coast of Pitcairn, and then Henderson Island. And we've got also some that don't seem to group quite so well. So this is a work in progress. We wouldn't necessarily expect everything to group geographically, but it's quite interesting that it does. And I think some of this will reflect the quite different geologies underpinning these different islands within the group, and therefore some of the ecology that will most likely form around those different types of substrate. Okay, one of the things that I think Hannah mentioned in the introduction was the Pitcairn Marine Science Base, and this is the development of a sort of laboratory facility on island. And as I mentioned at the beginning, all this DNA work and the carbonate chemistry work was done by taking samples back to Edinburgh, processing them through our labs. We are getting to a stage now where we can do this kind of work, particularly the DNA work, in the field or remotely in science labs. And this is something that we're thinking might be a possibility going forward for the Marine Science Base on Pitcairn, where we can use these kind of micro DNA sequences. This is a nanopore sequencer in this person's hand, and we can do the type of DNA sequencing required for this sort of environmental monitoring on island in a very remote and reduced way. So another type of data collection method for looking at biodiversity underwater are baited remote underwater videos. And the BRUV systems are deployed widely now globally as a way of particularly targeting fish species diversity, fish species abundance. And you can see in the picture on the top right here, you've got a video camera pointed at a bait that's suspended, or a bait box that's suspended underwater. This attracts fish. You video the fish, and then you can record and review the video to understand what's there. This has been a program at Pitcairn that's been deployed by CEFAS. So CEFAS have been collecting video footage from different parts, and there's a reasonable amount of overlap between the places and the depths that CEFAS have collected this data and the eDNA data that we've subsequently generated. And so one of the things we wanted to do was to look at the overlap and the differences between the BRUV data and the eDNA data and see whether or not one of these is perhaps more useful, or whether the combination of the two is a good way forwards. This is a series of maps showing where we've got both eDNA data and BRUV data from. And as you can see, the eDNA data is in the pink circles here, and the BRUV data is the green dots distributed around the different island groups. So we've got quite good overlap, but not entirely. So particularly for Pitcairn, for example, the eDNA samples are taken quite a lot further offshore. Oweno, it's a little bit different from the main part of the atoll. So we're hopefully going to get some correspondence between these two data sets, but there may be some differences simply in terms of where samples were taken. And I'm going to just go forwards to the results for this. So this is looking at the overlap really between the BRUV data and the eDNA data in terms of what was observed. So for the BRUV data, 17 families, 122 taxa, probably down to species level in most cases. For the eDNA, 19 families and 58 taxa, and an overlap in between of 18 families and 22 taxa. So that's really showing us that we've got quite distinct sets of organisms being captured by the two methods. There is some overlap, which is encouraging because it validates both techniques, but there's an awful lot of data coming in from individual methods, which isn't there from the other one. And in terms of looking at taxonomic richness, in the bottom left corner, we've got these accumulation curves, which shows that the BRUV data very rapidly identifies the majority of species, possibly in a relatively few samples, whereas the eDNA tends to increase the taxonomic richness more gradually over an increased number of samples over time. We're not quite sure how to interpret that yet. I think it might simply be an inherent difference between the types of data collection, but it allows us again to compare and understand what we might expect with further sampling using each technique. And then this plot to the right is looking at what happens when we try and use both techniques analysed simultaneously, and we try and tease apart the different sites. So we've got Adams Seamount in yellow, Henderson in red, Oweno Atoll in green, and Pitcairn in blue. And you can see if we do this type of analysis, this is a canonical variate analysis, and it's looking at trying to differentiate the different sites. And those sites do differentiate quite clearly, particularly Adams Seamount and Ueno Atoll. So you get both differentiation between the sites themselves, but also, and to some extent, the data collection method. So this is quite new data. We haven't really discussed this with CEFAS yet. That's something I hope to do in the near future. But we're trying to work out how best to work with that data and see whether this complementarity means that we should be really using both techniques going forwards. So a quick summary then of the ecosystem monitoring. We've got fairly good baseline data now for both marine chemistry and biology for Pitcairn Islands, and we really want to develop that baseline over time. It looks like for eDNA and BRUV data that they are fairly complementary. We need to dig deeper into this data to understand how best to use those two techniques, but I think certainly using them both going forwards might be a sensible idea. We're planning to complete analysis of these data over the rest of this year and hopefully get publications out towards the end of 2026. But this data should form some baselines for managing the MPA, also baselines for UK reporting against the Convention on Biological Diversity. And also I think it provides a lot of opportunities for developing on-island capacity and data production. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Georgia now and listen to what she's got to say.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, so you've just heard about all of the kind of natural science work being conducted in Pitcairn's waters. And that ecological work is really fundamental. Without it, we don't have any conservation. But I would now like to shift the lens slightly. So obviously, marine conservation is traditionally prioritized species counts and habitat protection, enforcement mechanisms, biomass recovery, and these are really, really important. However, when dealing with conservation, management, and especially coastlines, ecosystems are not just ecological systems. They are, whether we like it or not, socio-ecological systems. And on small islands especially, culture and environment are inseparable. So we're talking about livelihoods and language and identity and memory, which are all tied directly to the sea. So the question we asked in this phase of the project was quite simple, but also quite rarely investigated when we're looking at large-scale MPAs, which is what is happening to the people, to cultural heritage, to identity, and to community resilience when we develop one of the world's largest MPAs. So now that work moves from natural to social. You can understand the natural sciences helping us basically understand what's beneath the surface of the water, and now in the social sciences, we can look at what's happening above it. So Pitcairn is often introduced through the story of the mutiny on the HMS Bounty. That's not necessarily where the island's history begins. So archaeological evidence demonstrates there was Polynesian settlements centuries earlier. We have stone tools, petroglyphs, ceremonial Marai platforms. These were essentially seafaring societies whose cosmologies and livelihoods and governance systems were deeply oceanic. And then you see in 1790, the mutineers of the HMS Bounty arrived with the Tahitian women and men, and together formed this new kind of hybrid and geographically isolated community. Today's Pitcairn community is now fewer than 50 residents, and they carry this really layered history of pre- and post-colonial, Polynesian and British culture and more. So understanding that complexity is really essential if we're going to think seriously about sustainable conservation and heritage together. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so MPAs, environmental successes and social questions. So in 2016, the UK designated this, approximately 830,000 square kilometres around Pitcairn as this highly protected marine reserve, at the time, largest of its kind. Ecologically, this has been widely celebrated. The waters are among the most pristine in the Pacific, as Rob was mentioning, with the lack of industrial fishing pressure. So by most kind of biodiversity metrics, this is a success story. But here, the question that we posed was, does protecting biodiversity automatically protect people, protect cultural heritage? And the reason we ask this is because global research suggests that it does not. So the paper that you see on the screen is showing that around 1/3 of marine protected areas worldwide actually show negative well-being outcomes for local communities. So this kind of thinking really made the foundation for our 2-year sociocultural study to understand community perception, cultural heritage priorities, as well as perceived risks and shifts in identity over time on the island. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned before, Pitcairn has fewer than 50 permanent residents. So this really means that every resident is effectively a stakeholder, which means that the approach is very participatory, very community-led. So we began our first season there by conducting structured questionnaires and interviews. These really shaped how we developed the rest of our social sciences research. So in the second season there, we held a community workshop to present those initial results and then co-design with the community the direction of the rest of the research. After our workshop, we settled on household interviews to conduct free listing exercises, so where we essentially ask the residents to list cultural heritage resources that matter most to them. Then we ask them to assign value. So why do these things matter? Are they historical? Are they social, spiritual, practical? And finally, we ask them to assess risk. So what is most vulnerable? And alongside this, we conducted archival research of the Pitcairn Miscellany, which is the island's monthly newsletter, which spanned from 1962 all the way till now. So a really, really huge amount of archival data, allowing us to combine this kind of contemporary perception with a generational comparison and long-term historical narrative. Next slide. So some of our results, what we see on the screen is looking at the level of engagement that residents had with the MPA. So this is from our kind of first batch of research. So on the left there, we see that this is kind of a MPA development involvement. This pattern is expected. It's indicative of the various jobs everyone holds on the island. So some are more engaged than others. On the right, you see the vast majority of residents actually wanted to be more involved with the MPA, irrespective of whether they were involved with it at the start or not. And this was paired overall with a very positive sentiment towards the MPA. So this is really kind of providing our groundwork of how do people even feel about the MPA? Is this a success story to the community? And residents overall described it as good for various reasons, good for sharks, fish stocks. They suggested it was something to be proud of themselves. Many also spoke of contributing to global conservation, despite being one of the smallest communities on Earth. And importantly to them, fishing also remained culturally central. So it's small scale, it's subsistence based, but it's really locally embedded. So in short, environmental custodianship really came out as strong here. And there wasn't really much widespread resentment, if you like, of the MPA itself, which is really significant and really important for us to understand the rest of this research. Because as you see in the middle of that slide, the response to the protection of their cultural heritage was much more complex. Only a small percentage of people considered their heritage properly looked after. Many didn't know, but overall it was quite a negative response. Next slide, please. So when we look at the results of value and risk, we ask the residents what's the most important elements of their cultural heritage. The answers are really consistent. So they spoke a lot about fishing knowledge as a livelihood, as an identity. They spoke about Pitcairn language, which is a language unique to the island. They spoke about oral histories, the bounty story and the wreck of the bounty itself. Craft traditions, elders, and intergenerational memory. And when we asked what was most at risk, 3 themes really dominated, which was massively oral histories. We have an aging environment, so at elders' age, stories are disappearing faster than they can be recorded. Secondly, language decline. Pitcairn is under pressure from standard English and demographic change. And thirdly, demographic fragility. So a shrinking and aging population essentially creates structural vulnerability. So there is a critical opportunity here, and that is for the MPA management to continue its work in engaging with social and cultural elements on Pitcairn Island for the benefit of both the community, the heritage, and the surrounding environment. Because, you know, essentially in a community so small, the loss of even one elder represents really a significant loss of collective knowledge. You know, if we talked about that in ecological terms, that would be rapid biodiversity loss. Next slide, please. So these are some of the results that are coming out of our long-term research, archival research. So it's a really important factor to consider here is that Pitcairn identity. So that really reflects what is important for this community. So we're currently within that phase, highlighting how language associated with identity and heritage is shifting in real time using the miscellany archives. But the preliminary results that we're finding is that earlier decades emphasize much more bounty, mutiny, ancestry, maritime legend, isolation, and more recent decades increasingly talk about stewardship, marine protection, scientific collaboration, and this kind of element of global environmental responsibility. So there appears to be this kind of gradual narrative transition of what heritage means to this community, you know, from descendants of mutineers to environmental stewards. And this shift isn't completely uniform. It's generationally differentiated, but it is visible. So why is this important? So it may seem obvious with the development of such a large-scale MPA that this kind of shift would happen, but it's important for two reasons. I mean, we actually don't see this very often with the development of MPAs where local people are involved. You know, we've got a lot of research now suggesting there's often negative feelings towards it. And that identity isn't considered within it, which does show that this MPA and the science around it is playing a role in reshaping these identities. But that does also raise other complex questions, like, is the community becoming environmental stewards because of this MPA? Did that identity already exist and the MPA is amplifying it? You know, there's lots of different complex things to think about here, and that relationship likely moves in both directions. But this is why this type of cultural analysis matters. You know, it's for such a large scale MPA to be sustainable, it's essential that we understand this, we listen to, engage with, and follow community priorities. Next slide, please. Okay, so the central kind of academic tension here, looking at all of that data together, is that while environmental resilience might be strengthening, cultural resilience is not. It is more fragile. If we look at things like biocultural theory, that really tells us that ecological and cultural resilience are interdependent. So, for example, if cultural knowledge declines, stewardship capacity will decline, or if language erodes, so too does the transmission of environmental knowledge. Same with, you know, if identity fragments, collective governance is likely to weaken. And in small context, small island context especially, conservation that excludes heritage really risks undermining its own long-term success because of these reasons. So Pitcairn is really interesting because it provides this rare real-time case study of this quite complex dynamic in one of the world's largest MPAs, but embedded in one of the world's smallest communities. So, you know, this protected area is huge, the community is very small, and conservation policy needs to kind of be able to operate on this imbalance. So our question becomes, if we're looking at management and conservation, if we're taking these things seriously, what does that actually require for Pitcairn and for management of Pitcairn? Next slide, please. So our research suggests several preliminary but important directions this could go. So first, it's really clear cultural heritage is on Pitcairn. It's providing this identity, this feeling of ownership of the environment and stability within this very kind of small and isolated community. In contexts like this, identity functions as this type of governance infrastructure. So it's about stewardship, it's about sustainability. Secondly, there's a really strong argument for strengthening an internal cultural space, so space that's for community members, not for tourism regarding cultural heritage or for external display, but for intergenerational dialogue and transmission. Several residents express concern that heritage is either, you know, romanticized for visitors or insufficiently documented for future generations. So that really signals this need to prioritize this inward community sustainability and space heritage as much as this kind of outward representation that they already have. And third, it's important we really understand how to manage this tangible, intangible, marine and coastal cultural heritage together. So that means looking at languages and oral histories and fishing knowledge and sites and practices and stories alongside the natural science that we're talking about at the beginning of this talk. These involve designing co-designed frameworks and, alongside ecological management. But ultimately, what we're seeing from this is a fundamental point that we're seeing in research around the world, which is the Pitcairn marine ecosystem includes the community. Any attempt to understand or document or protect that environment must really recognize that community identity and the priorities and the livelihoods and the knowledge as intrinsic elements of the system itself. Next slide, please. So future opportunities. I think there is genuinely a really exciting opportunity here for Pitcairn's future. An opportunity not just to adjust management tools, but to evolve this kind of conceptual model of what large marine protected areas can look like. Pitcairn already represents this massive ecological ambition, but it's also beginning to represent this kind of nature culture management tool that we're talking about, where conservation recognizes that environmental resilience and cultural resilience are really mutually reinforcing. So if that perspective does continue to develop, I think Pitcairn really could become this kind of global example of how large-scale protection and small-scale community identity can coexist and strengthen one another. So yeah, Pitcairn is really showing us that conservation is much more than just protecting places and environment, but it's about sustaining these long-term relationships. Next slide. And I will now pass back to Rob.
Thanks, Georgia. So hopefully those two elements, I think, of the work that we've been doing at the University of Edinburgh on this Pitcairn MPA are really going to feed into each other. And some of you familiar with the Pitcairn systems may have seen bits of these presentations before. So what we want to do now is maybe look at how we can integrate those. Georgia talked a lot about the necessity of having a community element to any of the long-term sustainability of MPA activities, and just to look at that in maybe a bit more detail. So this is a very short section at the end where we just wanted to throw some ideas out there and maybe stimulate some thought and some questions as well from you as sort of remote stakeholders. So these people on this slide here are both the cultural heritage of the Pitcairns, but also the people who drive the marine monitoring. They're the people who manage the MPA. They're the people who help go out on the boats and collect the data and make that data available to people. They're also the people who build the Marine Science Base, and then will hopefully populate it and work within it. And so they're all of these things. It's a very, very small community. And as George has pointed out, they are central to pretty much everything that is going to happen from a marine protected area perspective. This slide here is just to sort of try and look at all the different elements that we need to bring together. On the left-hand side, we've got the things that I spoke about, really: the ecosystem monitoring, the sample collection, data production, the development of the Marine Science Base, the opportunities to collaborate between on-island research and the international research community, not just with CEFAS and Edinburgh, but potentially many more institutions globally. And that's very much the sort of bioecological side of MPA management, which most people are very familiar with. And then on the right, you've got, I'll refer to it as George's part, so the bit that relates really to this recognition of the value of the community, not just in doing a lot of the MPA management, but also that MPA reflecting their cultural heritage. So how that leads into local governance and some of the realities of life here as well. This is a very small island. This has got a largely subsistence community. They need economic resilience. They need sustainable use. And if the MPA is going to be supported into the long term, it needs to deliver on these aspects for the local community as well as just on global biodiversity conservation. So we're trying here to look at how we can fuse these things together and look at also potentially other models around the world where people have taken a similar kind of approach. So I'm going to hand back to Georgia now to run through a few of these sort of more visionary slides of what could happen and what perhaps should happen in the Pitcairn context in terms of community-driven MPAs.
Yeah, so when we talk about Pitcairn, it's really often described in these kind of superlatives, right? Of remote, of vast, of highly protected, biodiversity stronghold, and all of that is true. But as we've been talking about today, it's much more than that. It's a home, it's a multi-generational community, it has its own governance system, its own social dynamics, and it's deeply embedded in its cultural archives, which are tied to the ocean. And everything that we talk about in terms of the science that we do, the pelagic system, the fishing grounds, even the harbour, you know, these are really embedded in everyday life of these people. So if the ecological system and the social system are integrated in reality, then really our science must reflect that integration as well. Next slide, please. So there's kind of a little bit of a behind the scenes in terms of how it all works. So, you know, for us, interdisciplinarity isn't about parallel work streams. It really begins with, like, from the very beginning, from these shared research questions at the very start. So, you know, ecologically, we can ask, how has this no-take MPA influenced long-term ecosystem resilience? And this links to our social questions. How does this level of protection affect local economy and autonomy? And then culturally, how is ocean stewardship historically understood on Pitcairn? These questions are all really deeply interlinked, right? You know, ecosystem resilience affects food security, autonomy shapes governance. Historical stewardship frames how protection is interpreted and sustained. So yeah, importantly, you know, this type of integrated science, it really starts at the design stage for a project like this. Next slide, please. So that's the same for our data collection as well. You know, integration also happens in the field. So we do it all together. Participatory mapping takes place alongside the ecological sampling. And in doing so, you know, oral histories inform our baseline ecological data. Governance interviews feed directly into management design. And we're really kind of doing it all together, you know, rather than adding in a community or a cultural engagement later. So for a good example of that is, you know, while conducting sampling in the right of that picture, we were also doing participatory mapping in that same boat, you know, on that same day. And this was led by the community members themselves. So it was led by the people who knew the environment best, and data was collected for the community, with the community, not simply kind of about them or about their resources. And it means that everyone knows what's going on in all elements of the research all at the same time. And this kind of science, it changes both the method, but also the outcome. So it creates data sets that are socially grounded as well as being ecologically robust. Next slide, please. And this type of science creates these feedback loops. So, you know, ecological baselines, community priorities, governance structures all feed into another. This kind of research can be then combined into making these adaptive management recommendations. So it means that we have more ecologically robust protection, more socially legitimate governance, you know, culturally engaged conservation narratives. So nothing really in the work that we do is operating in isolation. And when these sciences all work together, the system becomes more durable. Next slide. Okay, yeah, comparative insight. So we're not the first people to do this. A really leading example is the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in Hawaii. So there we have indigenous cosmology, cultural governance, scientific monitoring, management, all operating in combination. So this is really widely regarded as a benchmark for large-scale marine protection because natural and cultural sciences are structurally intertwined. So yeah, I do think Pitcairn has the potential to work like this and to serve as a South Pacific framework for similarly socio-environmentally informed large MPAs. Next slide. So yeah, under the 30 by 30 commitment, so protecting 30% of our oceans by 2030 and then the UN Ocean Decade, as much as this being really globally relevant to these conversations, we also face a number of risks. So often these frameworks encourage creating ecologically strong but socially fragile MPAs because they're rushed and done too quickly. So we risk governance structures that lack local legitimacy and we risk conservation being perceived as kind of external imposition. So this type of integrated science really mitigates those risks. So yeah, when we have these natural, social, cultural sciences all operating together, we ultimately gain better data, and more sustainable systems. So more accurate baselines, better compliance modeling because it's grounded in lived experience, stronger demographic sustainability insights. So yeah, ultimately it's greater long-term sustainability. And we see Pitcairn as really becoming an excellent example of this. Next slide. Yeah, I'll end with a quick thank you. So yeah, thank you very much to CEFAS for their collaboration and their support. Of course, the Pitcairn Islands governance for their engagement. But most importantly, the Pitcairn community for their time, their knowledge, their warmth. This work really only has meaning because they've welcomed us into the conversations about their island and their ocean. So yeah, we're incredibly grateful. And thank you very much.